"You're in my seat," he said. And the way he said it, not as a question, not even really as a statement, but as a fact. He was simply announcing to someone who had not yet been informed of their own irrelevance, was the kind of voice that had never once considered the possibility of being wrong. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of that, before the voice and the charcoal suit and the hand that reached where it had no business reaching, there was a Monday morning in Atlanta, and a girl and a white envelope tucked into the front pocket of a Navy backpack. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 6:45 in the morning is not a place that moves gently. It hums and roars and pushes in every direction at once, and if you are not moving with it, it will move around you without apology. The terminal air smells of jet fuel and fast food and the particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from waking up before the city has decided to be awake, and everywhere you look there are people performing their own private urgency. Businessmen rolling carry-on luggage with one hand and checking phones with the other. Families dragging children who have not slept enough, gate agents calling out boarding zones with voices worn smooth from years of repetition. Coffee cups. Everywhere coffee cups. It was the kind of morning that swallowed people whole, where everyone was locked inside their own schedule, their own deadline, their own small and pressing world. But one person in that terminal was not in a hurry. One person moved through all of it with a calm that was almost deliberate, practiced even like someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness in a crowd was its own kind of protection. Her name was Zara Okafor. She was 10 years old. She wore a navy blue backpack over both shoulders, the way her mother had told her to always wear it so she wouldn't bump into people in crowded spaces, and she had on white sneakers that were still clean from the night before when her mother had knelt beside the bed and checked them one last time as though cleanliness were a kind of armor. Her hair was in neat cornrow braids pulled back with a precision that takes time and love and a fine-tooth comb, and someone who wants you to walk into the world looking like you belong in it. She carried a thick chapter book tucked under one arm, the kind that made adults do a small double-take when they realized a child her age was actually reading it and not just carrying it for appearances. Zara Okafor had flown alone before. That was the thing people would later struggle to wrap their heads around. She was not new to this. She was 10 years old, and she had already learned in the way that certain children learn certain things far too early, how to make herself small enough not to be a problem and visible enough not to be overlooked. She knew how to hand over her documents without being asked twice. She knew to sit in her seat and open her book so that strangers would read the signal and leave her alone. She knew how to smile at flight attendants the way her mother had taught her, warm, but not too eager, polite, but not helpless. She was 10, and she already knew all of that. Gate agent Sandra had checked every document in the white envelope with the careful attention of someone who had been doing this job for 11 years and understood that an unaccompanied minor was not a routine passenger, but a specific and serious responsibility. She verified the boarding pass, confirmed the authorization form, checked the emergency contact number, and placed a bright orange lanyard around Zara's neck with a laminated card that identified her as an unaccompanied minor in the care of the airline. She called ahead to the lead flight attendant. Then she walked Zara to the jet bridge herself. "You're all set, sweetheart," Sandra said. "Thank you," Zara said, adjusting her backpack straps so they sat evenly across both shoulders. She walked down the jet bridge with her book tucked under her arm and found seat 2A without any trouble. Window seat first row of first class left side of the plane. She sat down, slid her backpack under the seat in front of her, pulled out her book and opened it to the page she had marked with a carefully folded corner. She was reading a story about a girl who discovers that every door in an old lighthouse leads to a different century, and she was at the part where the girl realizes that the only way to know which century is on the other side of any door is to open it, because the lighthouse never tells you in advance. And that is exactly what makes it worth opening. Zara loved that part. She had read it twice already. She was on her third pass through the chapter when the boarding door opened wider and the business passengers began filing in. 2 nights before the flight, Adeze Okafor sat at the kitchen table in their apartment in Atlanta and did not go to bed until after midnight, even though she had been on her feet in the operating room for 14 hours and her hands ached in the specific way that surgeons' hands ache after a long and complex day. She had a shift again at 6 the next morning. She knew this. She sat down at the kitchen table anyway. She had printed 2 copies of everything: the boarding pass, the unaccompanied minor authorization form, the emergency contact card with her cell number and her mother's number, and the hospital's direct line, the medical release form, just in case. She had arranged each document in the order she would want someone to find them if they opened the envelope in a hurry, and she had placed them all inside a small white envelope and written Zara's full name on the outside in her careful, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who writes notes in margins of medical charts and needs every letter to be readable under any circumstances. She had folded the envelope shut, pressed the flap down firmly, and slid it into the front pocket of Zara's backpack. Then she had zipped the pocket herself slowly and held the zipper pull for a second longer than was necessary. Adeze had not chosen first class because she wanted her daughter to be comfortable, though she did want that. She had chosen it because she had thought it through the way she thought through everything, methodically running the variables, calculating for risk. First class meant a direct line of sight to the flight attendant station. It meant the front exit when the plane landed so Zara could be escorted off first. It meant close proximity to the crew if something went wrong, because something could always go wrong, and Adeze was a trauma surgeon, and she understood better than most people that the difference between fine and not fine is often just a matter of how quickly someone with authority can reach you. First class was not a luxury. It was the safest seat she could put her daughter in while still being 200 miles away. She had stayed up going through the documents with Zara at the kitchen table, testing her the way a surgeon tests a protocol, not because she doubted her daughter, but because certainty is built through repetition, not assumption. What do you do if anyone asks you anything? Show them the envelope, Zara said, without looking up from the document she was reviewing, with the focused seriousness of a child who understood that this was not the moment for anything less than full attention. And if they ask something the envelope doesn't answer, I ask to speak to someone in charge. And if they give you a hard time, Zara looked up at her mother. Then, and her eyes were steady in the way that her mother's eyes were steady, which was the kind of steadiness that is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of decision. I stay calm, she said. I don't give them a reason. Adeze had reached across the table and pulled her daughter close then and held her for a moment longer than she normally would have, the kind of hug that contains something unspoken, something that mothers carry in their chests like a stone. They have learned to breathe around something that has no name in any language, but is understood completely by every mother who has ever sent a black daughter out into a world that was not built to see her clearly. She kissed the top of Zara's head right in the center where the braids parted and let her go. That was the last time Zara saw her mother before she walked down the jet bridge of Flight 147 from Atlanta to Washington. What Zara did not know, what she would not have been able to fully understand, even if Adeze had tried to explain it, was the specific trembling of her mother's hands as she stood at the kitchen sink after Zara had gone to bed, rinsing the mugs they had used for hot chocolate, staring at nothing through the window above the faucet. They were surgeons' hands. They were steady in operating rooms when the situation was critical and the margin for error was zero. They were steady on floors when chaos was everywhere and someone needed them to be still. But they trembled now in the quiet kitchen, not from fear exactly, but from the particular cost of sending a black daughter into the world as prepared as you can possibly make her, and knowing with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who has lived this herself that prepared is never quite enough to guarantee safe. She stood at the sink until her hands stopped. Then she dried them, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She had to be at the hospital in 5 hours. You heard him before you saw him, and that was entirely intentional, though he would not have described it that way because men like Brett Holloway do not think of their voices as something they deploy. They simply speak, and they have spoken long enough into rooms that rearrange themselves around them that the distinction has ceased to matter. Brett Holloway was somewhere in his early 50s with platinum blonde hair going silver at the temples, in a way that his barber had once described as distinguished, and that he had accepted without comment because it matched the way he moved through the world, which was with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long ago stopped needing the world's opinion of him. His suit was charcoal and had been pressed within the hour, you could tell, because the creases were still sharp in a way that fabric does not maintain unless someone has just put the iron to it. He carried a slim, black, branded carry-on of the kind that corporate attorneys and senior developers use, understated and expensive in the way that the most expensive things always are whispering rather than announcing. "Holloway," he said to the flight attendant near the boarding door, the word landing with the particular ease of someone who expected it to be recognized. "Brett Holloway. Platinum status, 14 years running. I'll take the usual." The flight attendant reached for a glass of champagne before he had finished the sentence. He had been flying this route Atlanta to Washington National Monday morning's early departure for 3 years without interruption. The route was as much a part of his week as the standing Monday afternoon call with his partners and the Wednesday evening dinner at the same restaurant he had been going to for a decade. He did not need to check his boarding pass to know where he was going. He had been going there every Monday morning for 3 years, and the seat had always been there, and the champagne had always been poured before he finished saying his name, and the world, as far as Brett Holloway was concerned, had always arranged itself around his presence with the reliable efficiency of a well-managed organization. He moved down the aisle of the first-class cabin with the comfortable ownership of a man walking through a room that has always belonged to him, and he was already thinking about the call he needed to make before Wheels Up, already composing the first few sentences in his head, already 2 steps ahead of the present moment, the way he always was when he stopped. He looked at the seat. He looked at the child sitting in it. He looked back at the seat. The calculation that moved across his face in that moment was not something he would have recognized as a calculation because it happened faster than thought, faster than logic, faster than the part of his brain that understood words like fairness or assumption. It was the older part, the part that files and categorizes in fractions of seconds, the part that had looked at Zara Okafor in seat 2A, her navy backpack, her orange lanyard, her neat braids, her book, and had decided before a single fact had been consulted that something was wrong with this picture. "You're in my seat," he said. 2 words. No question mark, no excuse me or I think, or there may have been a mistake. Just the flat, impersonal announcement of a man informing a piece of furniture that it had been placed incorrectly. Zara looked up from her book. She did not startle. She had been startled before by bigger things than this, and she had learned that startling only gave people the reaction they were hoping for. She looked at Brett Holloway with those wide, level eyes, the eyes that were her mother's eyes, steady with decision, rather than the absence of feeling. And she said quietly, with complete composure, "I don't think so, sir. This is my seat." The word "sir" cost her something. The steadiness cost her something. She paid both without flinching because her mother had taught her to, and because she understood at 10 years old that this moment required every tool she had been given. She reached for the white envelope. She produced the boarding pass with both hands, the specific gesture her mother had taught her, deliberate and clear documents presented, rather than surrendered the gesture of someone who knows their ground and is standing on it without apology. She held it out to him with both hands and said, "My boarding pass says 2A. Holloway did not take it from her hands. He looked at it for a moment, the way someone looks at a document they believe cannot possibly say what it clearly says, and then in a motion so practiced it barely registered as a choice. He reached out and lifted the boarding pass off the tray table beside her. Not from her hands. Off her tray table, which was a distinction that every adult in the nearby rows understood immediately. Even if they could not have explained exactly why, it made the air in the cabin feel suddenly different. He turned it over. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change into embarrassment or apology or the small, honest contraction of a man catching himself in an assumption and choosing to let go of it. It changed into something harder and more deliberate, the expression of a man who has decided that the facts in front of him are incorrect, and that the correct response is to find the person in authority who will agree to say so. Flight attendant Patricia Owens had been watching from the galley doorway from the moment Holloway stopped in the aisle. She had been doing the math on what she was seeing with the quiet, practiced attention of a woman who had been flying for 17 years and had developed a specific and finely tuned understanding of the difference between a passenger who is confused and a passenger who has decided to be a problem. She stepped forward. "Is there an issue?" "There's been a seating error," Holloway said, turning toward her with the boarding pass. Zara's boarding pass, which was still in his hand, held out as though he were presenting evidence to a judge. "This child is in my seat. I need you to fix it." Patricia looked at the boarding pass in his hand. She looked at the orange lanyard around Zara's neck. She said with the careful and deliberate patience of someone who has learned that the most important thing in a moment like this is not to match the other person's energy. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" He produced his own with the brisk, slightly impatient efficiency of a man accustomed to being right, and Patricia looked at both passes with the unhurried attention they deserved. "Sir, this passenger is assigned to seat 2A. Your boarding pass shows 2C. That's not possible. I specifically requested 2A. I always fly 2A. Your usual preference may not have been available at the time of booking." Patricia said, her voice level and professional and warm in a way that was also unmistakably firm. The system shows 2C was confirmed for this flight. The cabin had gone still in the way that rooms go still, not because everyone has stopped moving, but because everyone has chosen to stop, because something is happening that they understand they should witness. Phones had appeared in hands. Not everyone was recording, but enough were. Holloway took a slow breath. He smoothed the front of his jacket with his free hand, the gesture of a man recalibrating, deciding on his next approach. "I have been flying this specific route every Monday for 3 years, he said. "I have platinum status with this airline for 14 years. I have never in 14 years been assigned to anything other than 2A on this route. Someone made an error, and I'm asking you to correct it." "I understand your frustration," Sir Patricia said. And she did in the way that people understand things they have heard many times in many forms and have developed a compassion for that is completely separate from agreement. "But there is no error. This young lady is an unaccompanied minor in our care. She has been assigned seat 2A by our ticketing system, and her documentation is completely in order." She paused for one measured beat. "I'm going to need you to return her boarding pass." A silence stretched between them longer than it should have been, longer than any adult in that cabin was comfortable with the silence of a man deciding whether he was going to let go of something or hold on tighter. Then Brett Holloway held out the boarding pass and dropped it on Zara's tray table without placing it in her hand. It was a small act. It was audible in the silence of that cabin. It said exactly what it meant. Zara picked it up. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in her backpack. She opened her book. Her hands were steady. She had made them steady through an act of will that no 10-year-old should have needed to perform, and every adult paying attention understood precisely what they were watching: a child putting on armor in real time in public in a seat she had every right to occupy, while a man stood in the aisle and decided that her composure was not enough to earn his acknowledgement. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Holloway said. "Of course," Patricia said. She walked toward the galley, and as she passed the row behind Zara, The woman sitting there, silver-haired reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, the specific stillness of someone who had been watching everything, touched Patricia's arm gently and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You're doing the right thing." Patricia gave the smallest possible nod and kept walking. Lead flight attendant James Obie had been in this job for 19 years, and one of the things 19 years teaches you is that you can read a situation from 20 feet away if you have paid attention for long enough. He walked up the aisle and took in the scene in approximately 2 seconds, the man in the charcoal suit still standing in the aisle with the compressed waiting energy of someone who had not finished saying what he came to say. The child sitting quietly in 2A with her book open and her backpack tucked under the seat. The tension in the first-class cabin lying over everything like smoke you could not quite see but absolutely breathe. He walked directly to where Holloway was standing and introduced himself with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who has faced enough difficult things that the ground does not move under his feet when something unexpected happens. "Mr. Holloway, I'm James, the lead flight attendant. I understand there's been some confusion." "There's been an error," Holloway said, and then he repeated the whole thing again. The 14 years of platinum status, the 3 years of flying this specific route, the expectation of seat 2A, the assumption that something had gone wrong in the ticketing system, and he spoke with the practiced fluency of a man who spent his professional life constructing arguments, every sentence built around the word error, as though if he used it enough times it would eventually become true through sheer repetition. James listened to all of it. He did not interrupt once. He had learned a long time ago that people who are performing certainty need to be allowed to finish because cutting them off gives them somewhere to redirect their energy, and what you want, what the situation requires, is for the performance to run its natural course so that the response lands in the silence afterward. When Holloway finished, James said with the quiet and absolute clarity of someone who has already reviewed every relevant fact and has arrived at the only position available to him, "I've reviewed our records and there is no error. This passenger was ticketed for seat 2A. Her documentation was verified at the gate. Her assignment is correct. Then the system made a mistake when my seat was assigned. Your seat was assigned correctly as well, sir. You have 2C. Holloway's jaw tightened. Something moved through his expression. Not rage, which would have been easier to address, but the colder, more controlled frustration of a man who was very accustomed to institutions bending in his direction and was encountering perhaps for the first time in a long time one that was not going to. "I want the seat reassigned," he said. James was quiet for exactly 1 moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that what he was about to say needed to land without the cushion of hesitation. Then he said, "Mr. Holloway, I'm not going to do that. There is an unaccompanied child in our care who has been assigned to that seat, and I am not going to ask her to move. What I am going to do is ask you politely to take your assigned seat so that we can complete boarding and depart on schedule." He paused. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" From the back rows of first class, someone started clapping. Just once, just a single, short clap, sharp as punctuation. Then 2 more people joined, and for about 3 seconds, there was a small, pointed, completely deliberate smattering of applause that died almost as quickly as it had started, but had said everything it needed to say. Holloway's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. He looked at James. He looked at the passengers around him, the phones, the watching eyes, the stillness that was not indifference, but the opposite. He looked at Zara, who was still looking at her book, though anyone watching closely enough would have noticed that she had not turned a single page in several minutes. Then Brett Holloway picked up his carry-on and walked to seat 2C. He did not look at Zara as he passed. He did not apologize. He sat down and opened his laptop and stared at the screen with the focused intensity of a man performing composure for an audience he refused to acknowledge was there. Patricia came back up the aisle and checked on Zara quietly, bending down so the words were just between the 2 of them. "You okay, sweetheart?" Zara looked up from her book. She looked at Patricia for a moment with those steady eyes, and then she said, "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." It was the voice of a child who had been taught exactly what to say, and was saying it correctly, even though the saying of it cost something that politeness does not cover. Patricia squeezed her shoulder gently. "You let me know if you need anything. Anything at all." "I will?" Zara said. Patricia walked back toward the galley. Zara turned a page. She was not reading, not really not yet, but the page turned and the plane continued boarding and the overhead compartments filled and the seatbelt sign came on and the safety announcement began. And in seat 2, a 10-year-old girl held her book open and breathed slowly and tried very quietly not to let anyone see how much the last 25 minutes had cost her. Because she had done everything right. She had kept her voice calm. She had produced her documents. She had not escalated. And it had helped. The right people had stepped in, the seat had been held, but it had happened anyway. The confrontation, the doubt the moment when a grown man had reached across her space and taken something off her tray table without asking, as though her belongings were not quite hers, in the way that his belongings were his. She was 10 years old. She should have been thinking about the lighthouse. The plane pulled back from the gate. The engines built to a steady roar. Atlanta fell away beneath them. The plane leveled off somewhere over South Carolina, and the engine noise settled into the kind of low, steady hum that usually made Zara sleepy on long flights, and she had almost found her way back into the story. The lighthouse girl was standing in front of a door painted the specific dark green of old copper, and she had not yet decided whether to open it when she caught herself clenching her jaw and consciously released it and realized she had been doing it for the last 20 minutes without noticing. Trauma. Even the small, everyday kind, the kind that arrives in the form of a hand reaching across your space and taking something without asking, does not leave when the moment ends. It stays in the body. It lives in the shoulders, which Zara's were still carrying slightly higher than normal tight, in a way that would ache by the time she reached her grandmother's house. It lives in the jaw, which she had been clenching and clenching again for half an hour. It lives in the eyes, which kept flicking up from the page every few minutes to check involuntarily whether the man in 2C was still in his seat. He was, every single time she looked. Laptop open, face forward, performing the very convincing impression of a man who has already moved on and is completely preoccupied with something important and definitely not thinking about what just happened. Zara had grown up watching her mother read people in the specific and careful way that doctors and mothers both learn to read them, and she had absorbed some of that skill without being taught it directly. And what she had absorbed told her that the men who move on fastest are often the ones who have moved the least. They simply get better at hiding where they are still standing. She told herself to stop looking. She turned back to the green door. "Honey." The voice came from the row directly behind her, soft, unhurried, the particular warmth of someone who was not trying to interrupt, but to reach across a small distance and connect. Zara turned. The woman who had spoken was somewhere in her early 70s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, the kind of face that has spent decades listening carefully to things and carries the particular openness that develops in people who have made a long practice of paying attention. Her name was Dorothy Webb, and she had spent 28 years as a school principal in Memphis, which meant she had developed a very specific and finely tuned radar for children who were holding themselves together by sheer willpower and trying very hard not to let anyone see the effort. "What are you reading?" Dorothy asked. Zara held up the cover. Dorothy read the title and made a small sound of genuine appreciation. "Any good?" "It's my favorite," Zara said. And then, because she was also her mother's daughter, and her mother had raised her to be specific about the things she loved. "It's the third time I've read it?" "Third time," Dorothy said, as though this were a serious piece of evidence that deserved to be weighed accordingly. "That's a real recommendation." She paused. "My name's Dorothy." Zara. Pretty name. Dorothy leaned back slightly, and then in the same gentle and unhurried tone, she said, "You doing okay, Zara?" It was 4 words. It was the simplest possible question. But the way Dorothy asked it, with the unhurried certainty of someone who already knew the real answer and was offering Zara the specific gift of permission to give it, made something tighten unexpectedly in Zara's throat. A tightening she had not felt during the confrontation itself, when she had been too focused on staying steady to feel anything she had not chosen to feel. "Yes, ma'am," Zara said. Dorothy held her eyes for one more moment, then she said, "You handled yourself beautifully back there. I want you to know that." And then, with the deliberate weight of someone pressing something important into another person's hands, "You didn't do a thing wrong. Not one thing." Zara looked at her. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite tears, but something that lived in the narrow space between the two. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Dorothy gave one firm, certain nod. And in seat 2, a something in Zara's shoulders came down just slightly, just enough for the first time since she had boarded the plane. Brett Holloway in 2C had ordered a second scotch at the 35-minute mark, and Patricia had noticed it the way you notice things when you have been watching someone carefully without letting them know you are watching, which is something that flight attendants who have been doing this long enough develop as naturally as pilots develop weather sense. She poured without comment, set it on his tray table with a smile that was professional and nothing more, and walked back to the galley thinking things she was not going to say out loud to anybody. Holloway, for his part, was composing an email. He had opened a new message and typed the name of the airline's customer relations director, a man he had met twice at Platinum Lounge events, the kind of acquaintance that exists in the specific register of men who move through the same expensive rooms and have exchanged enough pleasant conversation to create the impression of connection without the substance of it. He was writing carefully. He was choosing every word with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years in real estate development, learning that the first version of events to reach the decision-maker is the version that shapes everything that follows. He wrote about his platinum status. He wrote about 14 years of loyalty. He wrote about a seating irregularity that had been handled in a manner inconsistent with the airline's established protocol for premium members. He was very careful with his language. He wrote around the moment itself, the way a driver navigates a pothole, acknowledging the disruption without looking directly at what caused it. He did not write what had actually moved through him in those first seconds, when he had stopped at row 2 and seen Zara there. He did not write about the flash of assumption that had fired before logic had any chance to intervene, the split-second certainty that something was wrong with the picture in front of him. He did not write any of that. He had spent 30 years learning how to write around the things that could not be said directly, and he was very good at it. He hit send at the 42-minute mark, closed the draft folder, and took a long sip of his scotch. 3 rows behind him, a man named Kevin Marsh had been recording since the moment Holloway reached across Zara's tray table and lifted the boarding pass. Kevin was 31 years old, and he made content about food and travel, and occasionally the things that happened in between, the unremarkable and remarkable texture of moving through the world as someone who pays attention and has learned through years of practice to recognize the exact moment when something stops being a private event and becomes a public one. He had 19 seconds of footage. Holloway's hand, the boarding pass being lifted. Zara's face in that moment, the extraordinary, careful, heartbreaking composure of a child who had practiced this, who knew exactly what it was, and had decided in advance how she was going to respond to it, who was paying a specific and serious cost in real time to hold herself together in a cabin full of strangers. Kevin had watched the footage 3 times. He had not posted it. He was waiting. Not sure what he was waiting for, but certain that the waiting was right, that the moment to act had not yet come the way a wave does not come until it comes, and you know the difference if you have been in the water long enough. He watched the footage one more time. Zara's eyes in those seconds, wide and level, and paying a cost that no one in the cabin could fully see except perhaps Dorothy Webb, who was old enough and experienced enough in the specific science of watching children not fall apart to recognize it immediately stayed with him, in a way that he did not have precise words for, but understood in the part of himself that understood things before language arrived. He turned his phone face down on his knee. He looked out the window at the clouds below, white and flat and enormous. He was still waiting. James Obie was in the galley with the unaccompanied minor file open on the counter in front of him when Patricia came in from the service round and found him reading it for the second time, with the careful, methodical attention of someone who is looking not just for what is in a document, but for what might be missing, what might become a complication. What the file does not say that someone might later claim it should have said. He had been a lead flight attendant for 19 years, and he had seen passengers file complaints over things that described accurately would leave any reasonable person without words. He had seen crew members lose positions over situations where they had done everything right, every procedure followed, every protocol observed, and the complaint had come anyway, and the institution had bent because the complainant had enough status to make bending feel like the path of least resistance. He was not going to let that happen today. He was going to be thorough. He was going to document everything with the precision of someone who understood that thorough documentation was its own kind of protection. "Everything checks out," he said more to himself than to Patricia, turning a page. "Of course it checks out," Patricia said, keeping her voice low and even. "I checked it myself before we pushed back. I know you did." He closed the file and set it on the counter. "I'm going to call ahead to National. I want someone specific at the gate when we land. Not a standard handoff. I want a supervisor there. Someone who can walk with her directly to family and make sure there's no ambiguity about the handoff." Patricia looked at him. "You think he's going to try something when we land?" James was quiet for a moment, the thoughtful quiet of someone weighing not what they want to say, but what is accurate. "I think a man like that doesn't lose gracefully," he said finally. And the word enough was somewhere underneath those words, unspoken, understood, carrying the weight of everything Zara had already been through in the last hour, and I think she's been through enough today. Patricia pressed her lips together and nodded. James reached for the unaccompanied minor file again, pulling it open to the emergency contact page as a matter of routine. Logging the incident formally required reviewing the full file, and he was a man who did things in order because order was how things got done correctly. He found the boarding pass. He found the authorization form. He found the emergency contact page. He stopped. He read the name. He read it again. He read it a third time slowly in the way that you read something when you are not questioning the words but giving them room to mean what they mean. Dr. Adeyeze Okafor. Emergency contact. Trauma Surgery Department. Grady Memorial Hospital, Atlanta. Something changed in his face. It was not dramatic, more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, the way a room feels different when someone opens a window and something that had been still suddenly has movement in it. He set the file down. He stood very still for a moment. Then he picked it up again and read the name one more time. He did not say anything to Patricia yet. He reached for the interphone. "Captain, I need you to look at something." Patricia watched him make the call. She watched his face as he waited for the response from the cockpit, and she did not know yet what he had found on the emergency contact page. But she knew James Obie well enough after 6 years of working the same routes to understand that the look on his face right now was not the look of a man who had found an administrative irregularity. It was the look of a man who had found something that reordered his understanding of what was happening on this plane and what it meant and what it required of him. "What is it?" Patricia asked. James set the interphone down. He looked at the file. He looked toward row 2 toward the back of Zara's seat. The neat braids visible just above the headrest, the orange lanyard hanging slightly to one side. Something I needed the captain to know, he said. Captain Nadia Reyes had been flying commercial aviation for 24 years, and she wore her uniform the way certain people wear things not as a costume or a performance, but as an expression of something she genuinely believed in, which was that the people in her care had a right to arrive safely and to be treated with dignity for every minute of the time they spent in her airplane, and that those two things were not separate responsibilities, but the same one seen from different angles. She did the walk at the 50-minute mark, standard courtesy check. Nothing unusual about it. Shaking two hands near the back rows, asking a woman by the window if she needed more water. Exchanging a nod with a man reading a paperback who acknowledged her with the brief, comfortable recognition of a frequent flyer who has seen enough captains on enough flights to find the sight reassuring rather than alarming. She made her way forward with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who has learned that visible calm is its own form of communication to every person watching. She stopped at the galley. James was there, and the way he was standing, the slight forward lean, the file in his hand, the specific quality of attention in his face told her immediately, without a word being exchanged, that there was something she needed to know. "Talk to me," she said quietly. James handed her the emergency contact page and let her read it herself. Nadia Reyes took it and read it once, and then she looked up and her eyes moved naturally with the directional pull of something she had not expected toward row 2. She saw Zara. She saw the orange lanyard. She saw the thick book held open in both hands. She saw the neat braids and the white sneakers and the careful upright posture of a child who had learned that keeping herself composed and contained was the price of occupying space that other people had decided to dispute. "How old?" she said. 10, James said. Nadia was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was, and the man in 2C senior real estate developer based in Atlanta, 14 years platinum status. He's had his laptop open since we leveled off. Nadia handed the file back. She looked at James. "I'm going to go say hello," she said in the voice of someone who has already made a decision and is simply describing it. She walked to row 2 and crouched down beside seat 2. Actually crouched. Put herself at eye level with a 10-year-old child, which is not something most adults think to do, but which communicates something immediate and wordless to a child about whether the adult standing over them sees them as a person or a problem. The gesture cost her nothing. It said everything. "Hi there," she said. Zara looked up from her book. Her eyes went to the uniform first, the 4 stripes on the shoulder, the wings above the breast pocket, and then to the face above it, measuring the way children measure unfamiliar adults looking for information in the features that the words have not yet provided. "Hi," she said carefully. "I'm Captain Reyes. I'm flying your plane today." She smiled. "Mind if I look at your documents for a second?" Zara reached into her backpack and produced the white envelope without hesitation. The gesture automatic practiced her mother's voice in her hands. Nadia took it, opened it, and reviewed each document with the genuine unhurried attention of someone who is not performing thoroughness but actually being thorough. The boarding pass, the authorization form, the emergency contact card. She stopped. She read the name on the contact card again. Dr. Adeyeze Okafor, Grady Memorial Hospital, trauma surgery. She looked at Zara. "Is your mother Dr. Adeyeze Okafor?" "Yes, ma'am." Nadia looked at the card for a long moment. Then she looked at Zara's face, at the careful composure of it, at the eyes that were steady in the way that her mother's eyes were presumably steady with decision rather than the absence of feeling. "Your mother is a very brave woman," she said, and her voice was quieter now, the kind of quieter that happens when someone says something private in a public space and knows they are saying it publicly and chooses to say it anyway. "I know," Zara said simply as though this were the truest and most uncomplicated fact in her world, which it was. Nadia stood slowly, She looked over at seat 2C, where Brett Holloway was staring at his laptop screen with the aggressive, focused intensity of a man who has decided that the most convincing performance of not listening is extremely visible engagement with something else. Nadia held her gaze on 2C for exactly 2 seconds. Not a stare, not a threat, just a look that acknowledged for the record what was there. Then she turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Back in the galley, James was waiting with the tablet already open. Nadia had asked him to pull everything available on Dr. Adeyeze Okafor Grady Memorial Trauma Surgery, and he had done it with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the captain does not make that kind of request without a reason, and that the reason, whatever it was, mattered. He found it in under 30 seconds. A news article 14 months old from one of the Atlanta papers. The headline was still sharp, still carrying the full weight of what it described. Mass shooting at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. 38 injured 9. Critical, 1 surgeon. Credited with saving 27 lives. The subheading in smaller type. She was not on duty. She was dropping her daughter off for a flight. James went very still. Nadia had come into the galley behind him. She was not reading over his shoulder she already knew had known, since she read the name on the contact card had carried it with her through the walk to row 2, and the crouching down, and the looking at Zara's face, and the words she had said that had come out quieter than she had intended. She stood in the galley doorway and watched James read and did not say anything. She heard the shots, Nadia said, finally not reading from the article but from something she had already processed and placed, and she ran toward them. She turned the food court into a field trauma unit. She operated on the floor with her bare hands and whatever was in her personal bag. She paused. 2 of the people she saved were airline employees, a gate agent and a member of the ground crew. James looked up from the tablet. He looked at Nadia. "I know about this," he said slowly. "The gate agent she told me herself 8 months later when we were on the same layover in Charlotte. She told me the whole story. She told me the name of the surgeon who kept her alive on a food court floor. Dr. Adeyeze Okafor," Nadia said. "Dr. Adeyeze Okafor," James confirmed. Patricia had come into the galley while they were talking, arriving quietly in the middle of the conversation, and she had heard enough. She pressed one hand flat on the counter to steady herself in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence and everything to do with what she was absorbing. She was dropping her daughter off for a flight? James said slowly, the way you say something when you are not simply reporting a fact, but following it to where it leads. She was at that airport because of Zara. Because she was sending her daughter to board a plane. And then she heard shots, and she ran toward them instead of away from them. And she saved 27 people, and 2 of them worked for this airline, and now, 14 months later, that daughter, Nadia said, is on one of my planes, alone. And a man looked at her and decided she didn't belong in her seat. The galley was quiet, with the kind of quiet that follows something that rearranges the way you understand what is happening, and why it matters, and what is required of you. "What do we do?" Patricia asked. Her eyes were bright. She blinked twice. Nadia picked up the interphone. She looked at both of them, James, Patricia, with the steady, decided expression of someone who has been a captain long enough to know that the most important decisions are the ones you make before you are certain of the outcome, and that certainty is a luxury you do not always get. "We do what we should have done from the moment that man opened his mouth," she said. "We make sure that little girl knows exactly where she stands." She pressed the button. She cleared her throat. And then the captain of Flight 1147 spoke to every single person on that plane. Her voice through the overhead speakers had the particular quality that very few people manage to hold at the same time, authority and warmth together genuine. Neither one undermining the other, and every person in every seat on that plane heard it and understood immediately that whatever was about to be said was not a routine altitude update or an estimated arrival time or a recommendation to keep seatbelts fastened during the cruise. She thanked the passengers for their patience during boarding. She gave the altitude 34,000 feet and the expected arrival time at Washington National. She noted that conditions ahead were clear and that the flight crew was grateful to have everyone on board today. All of it routine, all of it delivered with the calm efficiency of a professional who has said these things thousands of times and means them every single time. And then she said something that nobody on Flight 1147 had expected to hear. She said she wanted to take a moment to acknowledge something. She said that every passenger on board held a valid ticket, that every seat assignment was legitimate, that the airline's responsibility above everything before everything was to make sure that every person on board this aircraft was treated with dignity and respect from the moment they stepped through the boarding door. Every person, without qualification, without exception. She did not name names. She did not describe the specific incident that had occurred during boarding. She did not need to. Every person in that cabin had been present when Brett Holloway stopped at row 2. Every person had heard his voice and seen the boarding pass lifted from the tray table and watched the exchange that followed, and every person understood with perfect and uncomfortable clarity exactly what the captain of their plane was saying and to whom she was saying it. In seat 2, C. Holloway had closed his laptop. His jaw was working. His hands resting flat on the tray table in front of him were very still in the specific way that hands go still when the person they belong to is exerting significant conscious effort over themselves, when stillness is not natural, but performed, maintained moment to moment through active work. When Nadia finished, the cabin was quiet for one full breath. Then Dorothy Webb in the row directly behind Zara began to clap slowly, at first deliberately, one clap and then another building, and the man across the aisle joined her before the third clap, and the woman 2 rows back joined before the 5th, and within roughly 15 seconds it had spread through the entire first-class section and into the forward rows of the main cabin. Not a thunderous standing ovation, but a sustained, specific, intentional sound. The sound of a group of people who had watched something happen and been uncertain what to do about it, and had now been given by someone with 4 stripes on her shoulder permission to say what they thought. Not everyone clapped. Some people looked at the seat back in front of them. Some people looked out their windows. That was true, and it would always be true. But enough people clapped that the sound filled the cabin and meant something and could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. Zara sat very still in seat 2A. She was looking at her hands, which were folded in her lap over her closed book. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were very bright. She was doing that thing again, the extraordinary and heartbreaking thing where she was working as hard as she could to keep what she was feeling from showing on her face, holding herself together with the same deliberate effort she had used during boarding, the same effort she had been using for the entire flight, the same effort that no child should need to maintain for this long, that costs something real and specific every minute it is sustained. She almost made it. Dorothy leaned forward from the row behind and put one hand very gently on Zara's shoulder and said right beside her ear in a voice that was barely above a whisper and pitched for Zara alone, "It's okay to let it out, sweetheart. You're safe." Zara pressed her lips together. She breathed in once slowly through her nose. She breathed out once, and then her eyes filled completely, and without warning, the way water rises when you have been holding a dam for too long, and the dam finally decides it has held long enough, and 2 tears ran straight down her face, one on each side perfectly parallel, like they had been waiting for exactly this before she could catch them. She did not make a sound. She did not move her hands from her lap. She just let them fall. Dorothy kept her hand on her shoulder and said nothing else because 28 years as a school principal had taught her that sometimes the most important thing you can offer a child is not more words, but the simple, steady physical fact of your presence. The confirmation that someone is there, that you are not alone in this particular moment, that the effort of holding yourself together has been witnessed and the cost of it acknowledged. She had offered this to hundreds of children in her career. She offered it now. The applause faded. The cabin settled back into its usual ambient hum, the engine noise and the distant sound of a drink cart and someone in the main cabin asking for a blanket. The ordinary texture of a flight reasserting itself. Zara dried her face with the back of her hand, one clean, quiet swipe, and opened her book to the lighthouse page. The door painted old copper green. The girl deciding whether to open it. She had read this page 4 times now. She read it again slowly, feeling each word the way you feel things when you are using them for something more than their face value. This time, for the first time since Atlanta, her shoulders were all the way down. The tension in her jaw was completely gone. She was just a girl in a window seat reading about a lighthouse with clouds sliding past outside the glass and the autumn colors of the eastern seaboard far below. Captain Nadia Rhea, having returned from the cockpit to make one final pass through the cabin before beginning descent preparations, walked the length of the plane with her usual measured pace. When she reached seat 2C, she stopped. She stood at her full height beside Holloway's row, not crouching, not leaning, simply standing with the particular stillness of someone who is not going anywhere and is not in a hurry and knows it. And she looked at Holloway until he looked up from the screen that had not shown anything since he closed his laptop. Their eyes met. "Mr. Holloway." Nadia said, her voice completely level, completely professional, carrying no accusation and no warmth and nothing that could be mistaken for either. "I want to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight. Is there anything you need?" The question landed in the cabin with the full weight of everything it was not saying. Several nearby passengers heard it. They understood it. Holloway understood it. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. "No," he said. "Nothing." Nadia nodded once with the brief acknowledging efficiency of someone who has received the answer they expected and walked forward without looking back. Kevin Marsh watched the footage for the 4th time. 19 seconds. Clean, clear, unmistakable. Holloway's hand reaching across the tray table, the boarding pass being lifted. Zara's face, in the moment it was taken, the extraordinary and specific composure of a child who had been told in advance in some way that this kind of thing might happen, and who had prepared for it, and who was paying the cost of that preparation in real time in front of a cabin full of strangers who mostly looked away. He had been sitting with the decision for an hour and 40 minutes. He was not a journalist. He was not an activist or an advocate, or a person who made it his business to document other people's difficult moments and broadcast them to the world. He made content about food and travel and occasionally the texture of moving through life as a person who pays close attention, and most of the time this was exactly as unremarkable as it sounds. He had posted things before that had traveled further than he expected, and left him feeling less triumphant than he had anticipated because the traveling of something is not the same as the understanding of it, and understanding requires more than a scroll. But he knew what he had, and he knew what it meant. And he had been waiting for the moment that felt right for the wave to be the right height, and he thought the moment had come. He was not posting it because it was satisfying or because he wanted the views. He was posting it because Zara's face in those 19 seconds deserved to be witnessed by more than a first-class cabin, and because a grown man had taken a document from a child's hands without asking, and a crowd of adults had mostly looked at their phones, and that was something the world needed to see clearly in order to have an honest conversation about what it meant. He wrote a caption. 9 words. A grown man took a boarding pass from a child. He posted it on 3 platforms at once simultaneously, and then he turned his phone face down on his knee and looked out the window at the clouds below and felt the particular unresolvable feeling of having done the right thing in a way that could not be undone. Cut back to seat 2A. Zara did not know any of this. She did not know about the 19 seconds of footage. She did not know that her face, the composure of it, the deliberate steadiness, the specific cost visible only in her eyes, was already moving through the world, traveling faster than the plane she was sitting in. accumulating views in the way that things accumulate views when they are true and recognizable to people who have lived some version of the same truth. She was reading about the lighthouse girl who had finally decided to open the copper-green door and was discovering that the century on the other side was not a frightening one, but a quiet one full of ordinary people going about ordinary days, and that the most surprising thing about stepping through was not the strangeness of where you arrived, but the familiarity of what you found, that people in whatever century wanted the same things, and that this knowledge was its own kind of comfort. Zara read that passage slowly. She let herself be there instead of here. She did not know that in approximately 20 minutes this plane would begin its descent, and that the world waiting for her on the ground would be a different shape than the one she had left. She was just reading, and for now, just for this moment, that was enough. James was on the phone with Washington National Operations before the seatbelt sign for descent had been activated, arranging the specific receiving party with the methodical precision of someone who understands that the moment a vulnerable passenger steps off a plane is the moment the airline's responsibility is most exposed to the things that can go wrong when nobody is watching carefully enough. He asked for Supervisor Michelle Ibarra by name. He had worked with Michelle on layovers in Washington twice in the last year and knew that she had the quality rare in institutional settings of understanding that protocol and genuine human care were not competing interests, but the same interest expressed in different languages. He told Michelle what had happened on the flight and what he needed direct escort from the gate. No handoff ambiguity family contacted in advance, supervisor physically present until the child was with her grandmother. Michelle said she understood. James believed her. In 2C, Holloway had been on his phone since the captain walked away from his row. He was not composing this time. He was calling, keeping his voice low, his body angled slightly toward the window, his free hand pressed flat on the tray table in the way of someone who is trying to appear relaxed and is not relaxed at all. He had reached the airline's Platinum Concierge line. The person on the other end had been professionally sympathetic, the trained warmth of someone paid to make premium members feel heard, and Holloway had described the situation in the framing he had been building since it started, a seating irregularity. A crew response that had been inappropriate for his status level, an announcement from the captain that he would characterize as pointed and unprofessional. What Holloway did not know could not have known, because the concierge line's internal protocols were not something that was communicated to members, was that calls flagging onboard incidents from premium members were automatically logged and forwarded to operations, and that his call had been tagged within 40 seconds and was already sitting in an incident file alongside the report that James had filed 40 minutes earlier. The security camera footage from the gate at Atlanta and the unaccompanied minor documentation, all of it in the same folder waiting. Dorothy in the row behind Zara had caught fragments of Holloway's low conversation, not the words but the cadence and the tone, which was enough. She said nothing. She returned to her book, but her attention was split, the way it had been split for the entire flight, because 28 years of school leadership had made her constitutionally incapable of turning off the part of her that tracks certain things, and what she was tracking was the specific and practiced language of a man trying to reshape what had happened into something more favorable to himself. And she had heard that language enough times in parent meetings and disciplinary hearings and staff disputes to recognize it on principle. The descent announcement came, the seatbelt sign illuminated with the familiar chime. Zara closed her book and tucked it under her arm in the same motion. She zipped her backpack in the specific order she always did. Front pocket first, main compartment second, checking the front pocket twice, because that was where the white envelope lived. She put both feet flat on the floor. She straightened in her seat. She had done these things in this exact order at the end of every flight she had ever taken, because her mother had taught her the routine when she was 7, and she had practiced it until it was automatic, and the automaticity of it was comforting. The way all well-practiced routines are comforting It meant that the body could do what it needed to do without requiring the mind to direct it, which left the mind free to be present instead of managing logistics. Patricia appeared at row 2A before the seatbelt sign had been on for 30 seconds. She came directly to Zara's seat, crouching down to eye level the same way the captain had, because some things are worth doing consistently. "We have a supervisor meeting you right at the gate," she said. "Her name is Michelle. She's walking you all the way to your grandmother." She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Zara's hand. "My employee number is on that. If anyone asks you any questions about what happened on this flight, you ask them to contact me directly. You don't explain anything to anyone without an adult you trust standing next to you. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Zara said, holding the paper carefully the way she had been taught to hold things that mattered. "Good girl," Patricia said, and stood. The wheels touched down at Washington National with the particular thud and shudder of a plane returning to the Earth's full grip, and around Zara, the first-class cabin did what it always does at landing laptops, snapping shut jackets, retrieved from overhead bins, the quiet reclamation of professional composure after hours of enforced stillness. At the cabin door, James stood as Zara stepped into the jet bridge. Patricia walking beside her with one hand hovering near but not quite touching her shoulder the way you walk beside something precious, without gripping it close enough for reassurance, without implying that it needs to be held. James looked down at her. "It was an honor to have you on board today, Miss Okafor." Zara stopped walking for half a second. She looked up at him with those steady, level eyes. "Thank you for what you did," she said. James nodded once, the kind of nod that carries weight, that means more than its own duration. And she walked out into the jet bridge, and the door closed behind her. And the story that had lived on that plane for 2 hours and 7 minutes began immediately and with gathering speed to leak out into the larger world. Kevin Marsh was sitting in a gate area at Washington National waiting for his connecting flight when the number started moving in a way that made him set down his coffee and look at his phone with the specific and slightly vertiginous feeling of someone who has thrown a stone into a pond and is watching the rings travel further and faster than a stone that size should be able to travel. By the time Zara stepped off the jet bridge, 600 views. By the time she reached the end of the concourse and found Michelle Ibarra standing near the gate door in the dark navy jacket and measured, capable presence of someone who had been told precisely what she was there for and had organized herself accordingly, 14,000 views climbing. By the time they reached baggage claim, the counter had passed 70,000 and was accelerating in that particular way. Not growing steadily, but lurching upward in surges, each surge larger than the last, that Kevin had seen enough times to know meant the thing had escaped the initial audience and was traveling now through different networks, each one picking it up and carrying it somewhere the last one hadn't reached. He put his phone face down on his knee. He stared at the departure board and thought about Zara's face in those 19 seconds, and whether he had done the right thing, and understood after a moment that he had, and that the particular unease he was feeling was not guilt, but responsibility, which is a different thing and which he was going to have to sit with. Zara knew none of this. She was walking beside Michelle with her backpack straps held in both hands, answering questions about whether she wanted water or a snack in the polite, composed voice of a child who has been raised to be gracious in unfamiliar situations and is being gracious now, even though she is exhausted in a way that goes deeper than tired. She was scanning the arrivals area as they moved through it, looking for the one face that would mean the day was over and she could finally fully stop holding herself together. She found it before Michelle did. Her grandmother, Ruth Okafor, was 68 years old, with silver hair worn in 2 thick braids, and the specific upright posture of a woman who has spent decades standing in front of rooms full of people and projecting the combination of warmth and authority that the best teachers carry naturally. She was standing exactly where she had been told to stand, holding a handwritten sign with Zara on it in large, careful letters surrounded by smaller decorative drawings of stars and what might have been lighthouses. She made the sign every time. Zara had told her once at age 6 that she loved seeing her name when she came off a plane, and so there it was every time without fail or exception. Because that is the kind of grandmother Ruth Okafor was. Zara walked faster. Then she was running. She hit her grandmother at full speed the way children run into the people they love when they have been holding themselves together for too long and can finally stop. And Ruth caught her with both arms. No hesitation, no adjustment. Just both arms, immediately and completely, and the specific tightness of the hold. Both arms. No hedging told Zara, without a single syllable, that everything she had been carrying since Atlanta could be set down now. She was here. She was caught. "I got you," Ruth said, her voice low and close and certain. "I got you, baby." Zara did not cry. She had used her 2 tears on the plane, and she was her mother's daughter, which meant she did not come apart in airports. But she pressed her face into her grandmother's shoulder and breathed in the smell of lavender soap and something warm underneath it. A smell she had been able to identify since she was old enough to identify anything at all. A smell that meant exactly one specific thing: safe. They stood like that for a long moment, grandmother and granddaughter in the middle of the arrivals hall at Washington National, while the world moved around them and the video climbed through 100,000 views and kept going. Ruth looked up at Michelle over the top of Zara's head, and the question in her eyes was not a small one, and did not pretend to be. Michelle read it correctly. "There was an incident during boarding that we're taking very seriously," Michelle said, choosing her words with the care of someone who has been trained in institutional communication and is also, underneath that training, genuinely troubled by what she has been told. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment, if that's all right." Zara's grandmother, whose name was Ruth Okafor, and who had spent 32 years teaching high school English in Washington, D.C., and had developed over those 32 years an instrument as precise and sensitive as any scientific tool for detecting the difference between careful language and evasive language, straightened her spine. She kept one arm around Zara. She looked at Michelle directly. "Tell me what happened to my granddaughter," she said. Not a request. Not a politely phrased inquiry, a statement of expectation. Michelle told her plainly and completely the boarding hallway. The boarding pass taken from the tray table, the crew's intervention, James and Patricia, the captain's announcement, the 2 tears, and Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting. Once her face controlled in the particular and deliberate way of a woman who knows that the child pressed against her side is reading every degree of her reaction and is making determinations based on what she sees, and who has enough experience with children in difficult moments to know that what they need in those moments is not to watch an adult come apart, but to watch an adult absorb hard information and remain standing. Her jaw worked once briefly. That was all. When Michelle finished, Ruth said, "I want the names of the crew members who protected her." Then, "And I want to know what the airline is going to do about the man who did this." Michelle explained the formal process, internal review, incident documentation, the standard procedural language. "I'm not asking about your process," Ruth said, and her voice was the voice she had used on the last day of every school year when she addressed the graduating seniors. The voice that was quiet, because it did not need to be loud to fill a room. "I'm asking what you are going to do about a man who physically took a document from a child's hands because he had decided she didn't belong in a seat she paid for." Michelle held her eyes. "I will personally make sure this is reviewed at the highest level," she said. "I promise you that." Ruth looked at her for one more moment, the measuring, unhurried look of a woman taking an accurate reading. Then she nodded once. "I'm going to call my daughter," she said, "and then we are going to have a much longer conversation." She turned and walked toward the exit with Zara tucked under her arm, and Michelle watched them go and then pulled out her phone and began making calls. But before she called Adeyeze, Ruth found a bench near the far wall, sat Zara down beside her, and opened the small notebook she always carried in her coat pocket. A plain brown notebook. Nothing special, the same kind she had been carrying since her first year of teaching. She did not ask Zara to do anything. She simply opened the notebook and began to write. Not a complaint, not a formal report. A letter in her own words, with the precision of someone who has spent 32 years teaching other people that words either mean exactly what you need them to mean, or they mean nothing at all, and that the difference between those two outcomes is always the writer's responsibility. She wrote about what Zara looked like when she came off that plane. She wrote about the white envelope and the folded paper with Patricia's number. She wrote about the way Zara had said I did everything right. Grandma not seeking comfort, but checking in the way a careful child checks in, wanting confirmation that the truth was what she believed it to be. She wrote one line near the end and did not cross it out. My granddaughter should not have needed to be that prepared, and she should not have needed to be that brave. She photographed the pages with her phone. She composed a brief email. She sent it. She closed the notebook. She put her arm around Zara. Ready to go. Baby Zara looked up from her book. Ready. Dr. Adeze Okafor was in the middle of a post-surgical debrief, 6 hours of reconstructive work, a case that had required the full concentrated attention of everyone in that room, and had demanded of her, as the most complex cases always demanded everything she had when her personal cell phone buzzed for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. She had silenced it twice both times without looking, because in a debrief you do not look at your phone, and she was someone who respected the protocols she asked others to respect. The 3rd time she paused and looked at the screen. 4 missed calls from her mother. She excused herself from the room. She called back before she had finished reading the notifications, while she was still pulling the door shut behind her, standing in the hallway in her surgical scrubs with the particular post-case exhaustion that sits in the shoulders and the back of the skull. Ruth answered on the first ring. "She's fine," Ruth said immediately, because she was a grandmother and a mother, and she understood, without needing to think about it, the precise order in which fear needs to be addressed. "She's right here. She's fine." "What happened?" Adeze said. Ruth told her. She told her clearly in sequence, the way Adeze had always asked people to report things to her chronologically, without editorializing, with the specific details included and the general impressions kept to a minimum. Adeze stood in the hallway of Grady Memorial in her scrubs and listened. She listened to the part about Holloway stopping in the aisle. She listened to the part about the boarding pass being lifted off the tray table. She listened to the crew stepping into James and his 19 years of knowing exactly what he was protecting to Patricia, who had been watching from the first moment. She listened to the captain crouching down to eye level. She listened to the announcement over the interphone. She listened to the 2 tears that had run down Zara's face when Dorothy put her hand on her shoulder. 2 tears. Parallel quiet. The specific and particular tears of a child who has been holding everything together for a very long time and has finally been given permission to let it go. She listened to all of it. She did not speak. "Let me talk to her," she said. Ruth passed the phone. "Hi, Mama. Hi, baby." Adeze closed her eyes. She leaned against the wall with her phone pressed to her ear, and she listened to her daughter's voice steady. "Clear okay?" The voice of a child who had come through something and was on the other side of it and was reaching back across the distance to make contact. She let the steadiness of it do what it needed to do, which was to reach the part of her chest where the fear had been sitting since the calls started, and loosen something there. "I did everything right," Mama Zara said, and it was not defensive and it was not proud. It was simply factual. The statement of a child checking in, wanting verification that the truth she believed about herself was accurate. "You did," Adeze said. "You did everything exactly right." A pause. "I am so proud of you." "I was scared, Mama, but I didn't show it." Adayeze pressed her free hand flat against the wall behind her. She stood very still in the hallway with both hands braced, one against the wall, one holding the phone, and felt the full specific weight of that sentence, which was the sentence of a child who had been taught exactly the right things and had used them and had come out the other side still intact, but also still 10 years old and still needing someone to say, "I see you. I know what that cost." That was brave. Being scared and staying calm anyway, Adeze said, is one of the bravest things a person can do. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Adeze straightened up. Something was shifting in her. Something that had started as fear was converting, as it always did in her, into the specific, focused energy of a woman who handles things. "I'm going to call the airline, right now." "Mama." "Yeah. I love you more than anything on this earth." Adayez pressed her lips together. "I love you more than anything on this earth," she said. "I'll call you tonight." They hung up. Adayeze stood in the hallway for 4 seconds. Then she took out her work phone, opened a browser, and looked up the airline's Executive Customer Relations Department. She finished the debrief in 11 minutes, efficiently, precisely, nothing omitted and nothing padded, apologized once for the interruption, gathered her notes, and walked directly to her office. She closed the door. She sat down. She opened her laptop. What Adayeze Okafor produced in the next 45 minutes was not a complaint in any sense that the word usually implies. It was not emotional. It was not vague. It was not the kind of document that could be read once and set aside with a note to the customer service team and a form letter response. It was a document in the way that a surgical report is a document, precise, chronological, factual. Every relevant detail included in the order. It occurred, the language stripped of anything that could be dismissed as overstated or personal or imprecise. She cited the unaccompanied minor protocol by name and section number because she had read it herself before booking the ticket. She described what had happened using the exact language of an incident report because she had been writing incident reports for 15 years, and she knew what that language required and what it prevented. She wrote what the man had done. The boarding pass taken from the tray table, the word error used as a framing device, the escalation after that. She wrote what the crew had done. Patricia James, the lead's specific words, the captain's announcement. She was careful. She was specific. She was above everything else, impossible to dismiss because every sentence was stated with the flat authority of something that had happened and been witnessed and could be verified. And then, at the end, one sentence that she wrote twice, reading it both times before she let it stay. "My daughter is 10 years old. She did everything she was supposed to do. Your airline failed to protect her from humiliation in a space she had every legal and financial right to occupy. I am asking you directly, and in writing, what do you intend to do about that?" She attached the boarding pass confirmation, the unaccompanied minor authorization receipt, and her full contact information. She sent the email to the Customer Relations Director, the Vice President of Operations, and the CEO. She had found all 3 email addresses in 7 minutes, because when Adayeze Okafor decided to find something, she found it. She sat back. She looked at the sent confirmation on the screen. Her hands, which had been absolutely still and precise throughout the entire 45 minutes, trembled slightly now that it was done. She looked at them. She pressed them together in her lap and held them until the trembling stopped, the way she held a patient's hand sometimes, when the patient needed to feel a steady grip, except that now she was both people at once, the steady one, and the one who needed steadying. This was the part nobody saw. Not the colleagues who called her fearless in department meetings, not the residents who watched her in operating rooms and understood steady to be simply a characteristic she possessed, rather than something she constructed and maintained at continuous cost. Not even Zara, who had grown up watching her mother handle difficulty after difficulty with a composure that looked from the outside like it required no effort at all. Nobody saw this part. The part after the part where she was alone in a room and everything she had been holding together for everyone else's sake finally had somewhere to go. She had faced gunfire. She had kept 27 people alive on a food court floor with her bare hands and whatever had been in her bag. She had made decisions in the middle of chaos that year and then come home and made dinner and helped Zara with her homework and not said anything to anyone about what the day had been because there was no useful way to say it and because saying it out loud did not make it easier and because her daughter was watching and her daughter needed to see her mother as the kind of person who walks toward the thing that needs fixing. And she had never in any of that felt as helpless as she felt right now sitting in a chair in Atlanta, knowing that her daughter had sat on a plane 200 miles away and been told not in words but in the language of a man's unquestioned assumptions that she did not belong. Because there is no procedure for that. There is no protocol. No amount of preparation or documentation or carefully chosen first-class seats can fully protect a black child from the moment someone looks at her and decides before a single word has been exchanged that she is in the wrong place. Adayez sat with that for as long as she could stand to. Then she stood up, opened her office door, and went back to work. She did not know as she walked back into the hospital that Brett Holloway was at that exact moment sitting in a parking garage in downtown Washington, D.C., watching his own name trend on his phone. He had found the news alert at 3:47 in the afternoon, a notification from a news aggregator he had subscribed to years ago for business reasons and rarely actually read, and he had clicked it without fully registering the headline. And then he had watched 19 seconds of footage that his own hand appeared in prominently, and he had not moved from the driver's seat of his car in the parking garage underneath his office building for 11 minutes. He watched it 3 times each time, trying to find the specific moment where what he was looking at could be read as something other than what it clearly was, some angle from which the reach of his hand toward the tray table looked ambiguous. Some posture of Zara's that might be interpreted as offering rather than having something taken. There was no such frame. The footage was 19 seconds of complete and unambiguous clarity, his hand the boarding pass, her face. Her face. The extraordinary, deliberate, practiced composure of a 10-year-old girl who had been told this kind of thing might happen, and had prepared for it, and was using every piece of that preparation in real time, and paying a cost that was visible only in her eyes, and even then only if you were looking carefully, and the camera had been looking carefully. He was at 2.4 million views. The number changed while he was reading it. He called his attorney, Carol Whitfield, whose number he had stored separately from his other contacts, under a label that was simply her initials, the kind of labeling that reflects a long-standing and occasionally necessary professional relationship. She answered on the second ring. "I've seen it," Carol said before he had finished saying his name. He began with the frame he had been building for the last several hours, the seating irregularity, the status, the crew's mishandling of a premium member's reasonable concern, and Carol let him run it for about 45 seconds, and then she said, "Richard, stop. Brett, I've watched the footage 4 times. It doesn't look worse than it was. It looks exactly like what it was." He asked her for a strategy. He said it the way people say it when they mean, "Tell me how to fix this," and what they mean underneath that is, "Tell me this can be fixed," and what they mean underneath that is, "Tell me I didn't do what I clearly did." Carol said, "Before strategy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer. Is there anything in your record, anything at all that resembles what's in those 19 seconds? The silence on his end of the line was its own answer. Not the quick, clean silence of a man thinking, but the longer, weighted silence of a man deciding how much of the truth is currently useful. Carol exhaled slowly through her nose. "Okay," she said. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything. Don't reach out to the airline. And whatever you do, do not draft any kind of apology until I have reviewed every single word of it." She would be there in an hour. He set the phone on the passenger seat face down. He sat in the parking garage with the engine off and the concrete wall in front of him and the number climbing on his phone under the face-down screen. He was not thinking about strategy yet. He was thinking about something else, something he had not expected to keep thinking about, which was Zara's face in those 19 seconds, not the composure of it, which he had expected on some level, which registered as a challenge, but the cost of it, which he had not expected, which he could see now that he was watching carefully, which was there in the specific quality of her stillness, the specific quality of her eyes, the way a person looks when they are performing something that does not come naturally and is not free and is costing them something real and specific every moment they maintain it. He had not expected to keep seeing that. He sat with it in the dark of the parking garage and did not move for a long time. Ruth had found the name in 4 minutes. 32 years of teaching. English had given her not only a precise understanding of language, but a specific and practiced skill at locating primary sources, which is a skill that looks effortless when you have been doing it long enough to make it automatic, and which is one of the most useful things a person can know how to do. Renee Walsh, National Correspondent, Civil Rights and Corporate Accountability. Bylines in 3 major publications over 22 years. The kind of journalist Ruth recognized, the kind immediately who wrote long and carefully and in service of something more durable than the news cycle. She had composed the email in 3 minutes, attached the photographed pages of the notebook letter, and sent it before Zara came back from the airport bathroom with her face washed and her braids restraightened the way she always restraightened them when she wanted to feel reset. Ruth had not written the letter to perform anything or to create a record or to launch any particular process. She had written it because she was a woman who used language the way her daughter used her hands, as the primary instrument of what needed doing, and because the thing that had happened to Zara deserved to be described precisely in full by someone who had seen the before and after of it and could speak to what the 19-second video could not show. She had written about what Zara looked like when she came off that plane, not distressed, not visibly damaged, but carrying herself with the specific and telling precision of someone who has been using every tool they have for several hours straight and is very, very tired. She had written about the folded paper with Patricia's number held carefully in 2 hands, the same hands that had held the boarding pass in the same deliberate way. She had written about the way Zara had said quietly and without drama, "I did everything right, Grandma," and about the fact that she had needed to say it, that she had needed someone to confirm it, that a 10-year-old girl should not need external verification, that doing everything right is sufficient. The last line had come to her without revision. My granddaughter should not have needed to be that prepared, and she should not have needed to be that brave. She had read it once. She had sent the email. Now, she sat on the bench and watched Zara come back across the arrivals hall with her backpack straight on both shoulders and her book tucked under her arm, and her white sneakers slightly less clean than they had been that morning. And she thought about a Dieze who had sent this child onto that plane as prepared as any mother could possibly make a child, who had chosen the seat and printed the documents and practiced the protocol, and stayed up past midnight making sure the envelope was perfect, and about the fact that all of that preparation had not prevented a man from reaching across her daughter's space and taking something from it without asking. There was no preparation that prevented that. There was no envelope perfect enough, no protocol thorough enough, no seat expensive enough. There was only what happened when it happened, and whether the people around you, when it happened, chose to see it clearly or look away. Ruth reached out and put her arm around Zara's shoulders as her granddaughter sat down beside her. Ready to go, baby. Zara looked up. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was not clenched, and she had the specific quality of someone who has processed something difficult enough to no longer be inside it, even if she was not yet fully outside it. Ready, she said. Ruth folded her sign, the sign with Zara on it, and the drawings of stars, and tucked it under her arm, and they walked out through the airport doors into the Washington afternoon, which was cool and gray and entirely ordinary. And the email had been sent, and the notebook was in Ruth's pocket, and the video had now been watched by people in 11 countries. Renee Walsh read comment sections the way a geologist reads rock strata, not for what each individual comment said, but for the pattern underneath the collection of them, the shape of what they were revealing about the thing they were responding to. She had been reading for 40 minutes before she started making calls, because 40 minutes was what it took to understand not just what people were saying, but what they were for. And she needed to understand what the story was actually about before she could know who she needed to talk to. She was 44 years old and had been a journalist for 22 years and had covered enough stories involving race and public space and the failures of institutions to protect the people in their care to have developed a very specific and precise instrument for distinguishing between a story that burned fast and a story that burned long. Fast stories were about outrage. They were satisfying and they traveled fast and they burned out clean. Long stories were about truth. They were more complicated and more durable, and they changed things that fast stories only disrupted. What she was looking at had the particular shape of a long story wrapped inside a fast story's packaging. The airline's first statement was 17 words of careful institutional nothing. The language of a communications department buying time and producing the minimum viable response to a situation they were still assessing. Renee had filed that under expected and moved on. Sandra, the gate agent who had processed Zara's boarding in Atlanta, had confirmed the paperwork and then said with the specific and careful neutrality of an employee who understood perfectly well that she was speaking to a journalist and that the company was watching no further comment at this time. Renee had written those 5 words down and underlined them 3 times. And then in her inbox an email from an address she did not recognize with the subject line written in the careful, unhurried handwriting of someone who had photographed a notebook letter and attached the images. She read Ruth Okafor's letter twice. She read the last line 3 times. Then she searched Dr. Adeyes Okafor. Grady Memorial Hospital. Trauma surgery. The shooting. The timeline. The photograph from the airport security footage blurry shot from above showing a woman kneeling on a food court floor, with both hands pressing down her posture. The posture of someone who has made a total and unreserved commitment, who has decided this is where she is, and this is what she is doing, and everything else in the world can wait. Her face was not visible. Her presence was unmistakable. She was dropping her daughter off for a flight. She heard shots. She ran toward them. Renee sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she opened a new document and began to type at the speed she typed when she was sure of something. She found Adeyes through the Grady Memorial Physician Directory and through a trauma surgery symposium program from 16 months earlier where Adeyes had presented and her professional contact number had been published, a detail that speakers sometimes forget about in the period immediately after an event when the information feels temporary and specific, but which is, once it is online, permanent. She left a voicemail. She sent an email. She composed a brief text. Then she returned to Ruth's letter and read the last line one more time. My granddaughter should not have needed to be that prepared, and she should not have needed to be that brave, and added a single word to her notes, underlined twice. Spine. Every good, long story needed a spine, the specific, undeniable, true thing that everything else was built around, and she had just found this one's. Not the video. Not the institutional failure. Not even the individual act of one man with platinum status and 14 years of assumptions. The spine was a mother who ran toward gunfire in an airport to save strangers whose daughter sat in that same airport a year later and was told without words that she did not belong. That was the story. The text arrived between patients while Adeyes was standing in the hallway reviewing the chart for her next consult, and she read it twice before she understood what all of it meant. Together, the journalist's name. The Word published the phrase before I publish, and then she understood, and she put the chart under her arm, and found an empty consultation room and closed the door. She called back. Renee answered on the second ring. "Dr. Okafor, thank you for calling me back." "What do you know?" Adayeze said, because she never had time for preamble and did not intend to develop a habit of it today. Renee told her the flight, the video, the research she had done, and then the man who took your daughter's boarding pass filed a formal complaint against the crew members who protected her. He filed it before your daughter reached baggage claim. Adayeze went very still. The kind of still that is not calm, but its precise opposite. Everything compressed into a single point of attention, all the noise of the day falling completely away. "Did you know that?" No, Adayeze said. "I did not know that." He described Zara as, and I'm quoting directly from the complaint, a disruptive minor who was improperly prioritized over a senior loyalty member. A pause. He did not use her name. He filed the complaint before she reached baggage claim. The consultation room was very quiet. Adayeze could hear the hospital through the closed door, the PA system, the distant sound of a cart in the hallway, and under it, the specific silence of what she was absorbing. "He filed against the people who protected her," she said. "Yes. Are the crew members facing any action because of his complaint, Renee?" As of 2 hours ago, the airline had not responded to my inquiry on that specific point. But I have a source inside operations who tells me that Holloway's complaint was flagged by a duty manager before it cleared the first level of review. His complaint is in the system. James Obie's incident report is in the system. The security footage from Atlanta is in the system. A pause. "And your email this morning was forwarded internally 9 times in the first hour after you sent it. It reached the CEO's desk before noon." Something shifted in Adayeze's chest. Not relief. She was too careful for relief this early, too experienced with the way things that looked resolved could unravel, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like the specific recognition that the fight she had already committed herself to was not one she was having entirely alone. 9 times, she said. It reached the CEO's desk before noon. Renee confirmed. "What do you need from me? I'd like to interview you on the record. I want to understand who Zara is, not as a symbol, not as a subject, but as a person. I want to understand what you were thinking when you chose that seat, what you felt when you got the call, and I want to understand what the 19-second video doesn't show, the before and the after of it, the full shape of what happened." Renee paused. "The video is doing a lot of work right now, but video without context is just emotion. I want the context that makes the emotion mean what it should mean." Adayeze was quiet for a moment. "I need to talk to my daughter first," she said. "She is 10 years old, and this is her story, not mine, and I'm not going to put it any further into the world without her understanding what that means and agreeing to it." "Of course," Renee said without hesitation. "I'll be available whenever you're ready." "I'll call you tonight," Adayeze said. "If she says yes, we talk tomorrow." She hung up. She sat in the consultation room for a moment with all of it moving through her at once, the complaint, the 9 email forwards, the journalist, the crew members sitting somewhere tonight with Holloway's complaint in a file next to their own incident report. Then she called Ruth. "Put her on." "Hi, Mama. Hi, baby. How was your afternoon?" "Good." "Grandma Ruth made soup." A pause. "It had those little pasta stars in it. She always makes the pasta stars when you visit." "I know. I love those." There was a moment of ordinary warmth between them. The specific, unhurried warmth of a mother and daughter who know how to be in a conversation together. And then Adayeze said Zara. "I need to talk to you about something." She explained it carefully in the language she used when she needed Zara to understand something real and complex, without having the complexity obscured by the simplification of it. A journalist wanted to write the full story, not just the 19 seconds, but everything. What had happened, who Zara was, what their family was, what Adayeze had been doing in that airport 14 months ago. The whole story told right for a lot of people to read. I am not going to say yes to that without asking you first, Adeze said. This is your story. You are the one who gets to decide what happens to it. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a 10-year-old who has understood what is being asked of them and is taking it seriously in the way that children take things seriously when the adults in their lives have always treated their opinions as something that matters. It was a thoughtful silence. Adeze waited. Why does she want to tell it? Zara said. Adeze had prepared for several different questions. She had not been fully prepared for that specific one which went directly to the center of what mattered with the uncanny directional instinct that her daughter's questions had always had. Because she thinks people need to hear it, Adeze said carefully. Not just the 19 seconds, the whole thing. The before and the after. What it actually meant. Another silence, shorter this time. Then, are there other kids who feel like they don't belong in places they have every right to be? Yes, baby. There are. Would the story help them? Like, would they feel less alone? Adeze's throat tightened. I think it might, she said. I think it could help a lot of people feel less alone. Not just kids, but especially kids. A pause. Then, in the same quiet and certain voice that Zara used when she had thought something through and arrived at the only answer that made sense to her, yes, tell it. Adeze closed her eyes. She pressed her lips together and sat with it for one full second. Okay, she said. I'll call her tonight. Mama. Yeah. Make sure she tells it right, Zara said. Make sure she says I was scared, but I wasn't scared. You know what I mean. Adeze laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, slightly broken at the edges, but completely real. I know exactly what you mean, she said. I'll make sure. She hung up. She sat in the consultation room with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance and thought about her daughter sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with a glass of orange juice and a book she had read 3 times, saying yes, tell it not because anyone had coached her, not because it was the brave answer or the impressive answer, but because Zara Okafor had thought about whether her story could be useful to another child who was sitting somewhere feeling alone, and had decided that it could, and had said yes for that reason. That was the whole of it. That was who her daughter was. Adeze picked up her phone and called Renee Walsh. By 6 o'clock that evening, the airline had issued a second statement, and it was different from the first in every way that mattered in length, in specificity, in the willingness to say a direct thing directly, instead of hiding behind the institutional language that is designed to sound like communication, while communicating nothing of substance. It was 4 paragraphs. It acknowledged explicitly that an incident had occurred on Flight 1147. It stated that the safety and dignity of all passengers, including unaccompanied minors in the airline's care, were the airline's highest responsibility above revenue and above status and above the comfort of any individual passenger who chose to mistake their loyalty tier for a claim on someone else's assigned seat. It stated that crew members Patricia Owens and James Obey had acted in complete accordance with airline policy and in the best possible service of the passenger in their care. It stated that both crew members had been formally commended, not a memo, not a verbal acknowledgement passed through a manager, but a documented commendation in their permanent professional records, something that would follow them and define them and stand as evidence for the rest of their careers, that they had been exactly right at exactly the moment it counted. The complaint filed against them had been withdrawn and expunged. It did not exist in their records. It was gone. One sentence near the end had clearly cost the communications team some debate before it found its final form, because it was more direct and specific than everything surrounding it. The kind of sentence that cannot have been written by a committee but must have been insisted upon by someone with sufficient authority to insist, We do not tolerate behavior that demeans or discriminates against any passenger on the basis of race, age, or any other characteristic, and we take all reports of such behavior with the utmost seriousness. Patricia Owens read the statement on her phone in the crew lounge at Washington National, sitting next to James. Both of them still in uniform from the return flight they had worked after the original layover, both of them with the specific exhaustion of people who have carried something heavy all day and are only now beginning to put it down. "They defended us," Patricia said. She said it with the slight and honest uncertainty of someone who had been hoping for this and had not entirely trusted that it would happen, which was the uncertainty of someone who had been in this industry long enough to have seen institutions go the other way. "They defended us," James confirmed. Patricia exhaled. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. "What about him?" she said. "What actually happens to him?" James was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have thoughts about it, but because the accurate answer was the uncertain one. "I don't know yet," he said. "That part I don't know." They sat with the uncertainty together, the particular suspended quality of waiting for an institution to do the right thing in a situation where you have some evidence that it intends to, but no guarantee yet of what that will actually mean. And Patricia thought about something the duty manager had mentioned in passing earlier in the afternoon, something about Adaize Okafor's email having traveled to a level of the organization that these things do not usually travel to, and the pace at which it had traveled there. "I think Dr. Okafor wrote something that was impossible to ignore," James said finally, as though he had been following the same thread of thought from a different starting point and had arrived at the same place. The precision of it, the documentation, the question at the end. Patricia nodded. She thought about the orange lanyard and the white sneakers and the book held open to a page that Zara had not turned for several minutes during the boarding confrontation. "I hope she knows." Patricia said quietly how much she helped her daughter today, even from 200 miles away, even without knowing it was happening. The meeting with Carol Whitfield had been going for 2.5 hours, and it had not gone the way Brett Holloway had expected it to go, which was to say it had not gone in his favor in any of the ways he had in the car on the way to the office quietly imagined it might. Carol Whitfield was 56 years old, had been in litigation for 29 years, and had a very specific and highly developed intolerance for the moment in a client meeting, when the client attempts to describe what happened in terms that would require her to share a belief in a version of reality that she does not inhabit. She had seen the footage. She had read the complaint he had filed. She had done both before his car arrived at the building, and she had sat with both long enough to have a clear and unmistakable picture of where things stood. "You filed the complaint before the plane finished taxiing to the gate," she said. "I filed it because the crew—" "You filed it before she reached baggage claim." Slower now, each word placed with emphasis because she needed him to understand that this specific detail, the speed of the filing, the timing of it, the fact that he had done it before the child, whose boarding pass he had taken from her tray table, had even collected her luggage, was not a minor thing in the current environment, but a significant and specific thing that told a story all by itself. The video had now been watched 8 million times. His name appeared in comment sections in a number of languages. 3 attorneys that Carol knew personally had already reached out to ask whether the family had representation. "The complaint does 2 things for you right now, Brett," Carol said with the flat, precise directness that she had learned to use with clients who had a tendency to hear what they wanted to hear, rather than what was actually being said. "It tells the world that you went home and immediately tried to punish the crew members who stood up for that child. And it tells the airline's legal department that you created additional institutional liability for them after the incident was already on record." She closed her folder. "You didn't just embarrass yourself on a plane. You handed them a reason to make you the story." Holloway said nothing. His jaw was working in the way it had been working intermittently since he sat down, the specific jaw movement of a man who has a number of things he wants to say and is aware that none of them are helpful. "What do I do?" he said. "First, you withdraw the complaint. Tonight in writing, you state that upon reflection you believe the crew acted appropriately, and you retract any characterization of their conduct as unprofessional or in violation of protocol." "And if I don't," Carol looked at him with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already thought through all of the available endings. "Then I can't help you," she said simply. "Because the alternative is a permanent record in which a man with your profile filed a formal complaint against the crew members who protected a 10-year-old black girl from being displaced from a seat she paid for. That record will exist. It will be discoverable. It will be cited in any proceeding that follows, and no amount of platinum status will make it go away." Holloway picked up a pen. He set it down. He looked at the wall for a moment in the way of a man who had spent his entire adult life in rooms where things resolved in his direction and was in the unfamiliar position of being the thing that needed resolving. He picked up the pen again. "Draft it," he said. Carol opened her laptop. She did not say anything further. She began to type. Captain Nadia Reyes was in her kitchen making dinner when the message from James arrived, brief, factual, the kind of message James sent because he was a person who reported what had happened without editorializing, which was a quality Nadia had always found deeply valuable. The commendation was official in both their permanent records as of this afternoon. The complaint had been withdrawn and expunged. The airline's second statement had been released publicly. She read the message once. She set her phone down on the counter. She stood with her hands flat on the tile, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a girl in seat 2. A, with white sneakers that were still clean, and a book tucked under her arm, and a white envelope in the front pocket of her backpack, and about what it meant that all of those things, the preparation, the documents, the composure, the practiced steadiness, had been necessary at all. Her wife Sophia came in from the living room and looked at her face and said, "What happened today?" Nadia told her. All of it, from the incident report James had handed her in the galley to the name on the emergency contact card, to the moment she had crouched beside seat 2A and looked at Zara's face. She told it in the way people tell stories when the story is still active inside them, not summarizing but unfolding following the sequence, because the sequence is the only way to carry someone else through the shape of what happened. When she finished, Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's 10. 10, Nadia said. "You did the right thing." "I know. I keep thinking about whether I did it fast enough." Sophia moved to stand beside her and put her hand over Nadia's on the counter, and they stood together in the kitchen with the food going cool on the stove, and the question hanging between them in the way that certain questions hang unanswerable in any final sense, but absolutely worth sitting with because the sitting with them is its own kind of answer, or at least the beginning of one. That was the truth of it, not just for Nadia, but for all of them tonight. For Patricia, thinking about the moment she had stepped forward from the galley. For James, thinking about the 19 years and what they were for. For Dorothy back in Memphis, now thinking about the hand on the shoulder and whether 4 words "you're safe" had been enough. For Kevin, staring at a comment count and feeling the specific responsibility of having set something in motion. For every person who had clapped and every person who had looked at their seat back and felt afterward the particular weight of having looked away. All of them sitting tonight in some version of the same question: was what I did enough? Did I move fast enough? And the next time, because there will be a next time somewhere on some plane or in some room or in some space where a child who looks like Zara is told without words that she does not belong, will I move faster? That was the question that would outlast the video and the statements and the commendations and the viral counts. That was the question worth carrying. Sophia said, "You crouched down to her level. Nadia looked at her. "You went to her level," Sophia said again more gently. "Not everyone thinks to do that. It's a small thing, and it's not a small thing." Nadia thought about Zara's face when she had crouched down beside seat 2. The way her eyes had moved from the 4 stripes to the face above them, looking for information about whether she was safe. She thought about the way something had shifted in that face when Nadia had introduced herself, not as an authority, but as a person who was flying the plane. "I hope it helped," Nadia said. "It did," Sophia said with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need evidence to be sure of the things they were sure of. "It did." The call came from the airline's communications director at 4:18 in the afternoon, and when Renee Walsh saw the corporate number on her screen, she sat up straight at her desk and reached for her recording device before she had fully finished deciding to answer. "Miss Walsh, the communications director said the CEO would like to speak with you." Thomas Park had been CEO of the airline for 6 years, and the 6 years had taught him things about crisis management that he had not known going in, including the most important thing, which was that the difference between a crisis that ends well and a crisis that defines your company for the next decade is almost never about the crisis itself. It is about the response time. It is about the willingness to say a specific, true, accountable thing in plain language instead of retreating into the institutional language that is designed to provide cover and always fails to do anything else. He had made mistakes early in his tenure that had cost him credibility. He had spent years rebuilding. He did not intend to make the same kind of mistake today. "I've read Dr. Okafor's letter 4 times, he told Renee on the record. "I want to be clear about that, not because someone has told me to say it, but because it matters that she wrote it, and it matters that I read it, and it matters that it changed the pace and the shape of what we did next." "What specifically did it change?" "It changed the speed, and it changed the frame." He paused. "She didn't write to us asking for a voucher or an upgrade or a gesture. She asked us a direct question: what do you intend to do about this? That question, framed exactly that way, required a direct answer. It couldn't be managed. It could only be answered. The answer, crew members Patricia Owens and James Obey formally commended, documented in their permanent records. The complaint filed against them withdrawn and expunged, removed from their records entirely. Holloway's Platinum membership suspended pending internal review. The footage reviewed thoroughly. What it showed was, in the CEO's words, not consistent with the standard of conduct we require of everyone who boards our aircraft, and I do mean everyone without exception, Renee said. "When you read Dr. Okafor's letter, the last line specifically, what did you think?" There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that sounds like a person who is deciding between the polished answer and the honest one and who has made a choice. "I thought about my own daughter," Thomas Park said. "She's 7. And I thought about what I would need someone to tell her on the other side of something like that. What I would need an institution to say to her about what she was worth." He stopped. "And then I thought about the fact that Dr. Okafor's daughter should not have needed an institution to tell her that. She should have been told it by the behavior of every adult in that cabin from the moment she sat down." Renee wrote it down. She read it back to herself. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Park." "Thank you for the story," he said. And he said it in the plain and unperforming voice of someone who genuinely meant it, who understood that the story being told publicly was also the story he needed told inside his own company, who was grateful not for the coverage, but for the clarity that a well-reported story can force upon an institution that needs to see itself honestly. Renee ended the call. She looked at what she had. She opened a new document. She wrote the headline first, the way she always wrote the headline, not as a hook or a grab, but as a compression of the true thing the spine made visible. A surgeon ran toward the shots. Her daughter deserved 1 seat. She looked at it. She kept it. She started writing. Renee published at 6:42 in the morning, and by 7 o'clock it had broken through every algorithm that existed to slow these things down, which meant it had found the people who needed to find it before any machine had finished deciding whether it deserved to be found. The headline sat above 1,400 words of reported truth, and together they did something that the 19-second video, which had by now been watched by 11 million people, had not quite managed alone, which was to give the story a spine, a before and an after. A context deep enough that the emotion it produced was not just immediate and reactive, but rooted in something durable, something that would last past the scroll and the share and the closing of the tab. Adiez read it in her car in the Grady Memorial parking garage at 6:52 in the morning, still in the clothes she had worn through the previous day's surgeries, 3 hours of sleep from the attending lounge engine off phone held in both hands, reading in the particular focused stillness she brought to things that required her full attention. Renee had done exactly what she had promised. She had written about the unaccompanied minor protocol and what it meant, not as a bureaucratic procedure, but as a mother's calculation, a decision made at midnight about where the safest seat on a plane was for a child who had to travel alone. She had written about the boarding pass, not just the taking of it, but what a boarding pass is, what it represents, what it means when someone takes it from a child's hands, without asking what that act says about who the taker believes they are and who the child believes herself to be. She had written about Patricia stepping forward, about James holding the line, about Captain Reyes, who had crouched beside a 10-year-old at eye level because some gestures communicate something that authority alone never can. She had written about Dorothy, 71 years old, retired school principal, who had put her hand on a child's shoulder and said 4 words, and meant them as a complete sentence. She had written about Zara not as a symbol or a subject or a vehicle for a larger argument, but as a person, a 10-year-old who had flown alone before and knew the routine and had her documents in perfect order and had held herself together with a composure that no child her age should have needed to practice, and who had let 2 tears fall and dried her face with the back of her hand and opened her book and kept reading. And near the end, 1 sentence, 12 words, Zara's own, approved the night before, after Adeze had read it 3 times and called Zara and read it to her and asked if it was right, which it was. I was scared. But I don't want another kid to feel like they don't belong. Adeze sat in the parking garage and read that sentence again. Her daughter had said that. At Ruth's kitchen table with a glass of orange juice and a lighthouse book, not performing anything for anyone, just meaning it. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She sat alone in the car and let herself feel the full weight of it. The fear from the call, the helplessness, the fury, the grief of a mother who has prepared her child as thoroughly as any mother has ever prepared any child, and knows that prepared is never quite enough to prevent the specific and particular cruelty of being looked at and decided against before you have spoken a single word. She felt all of it compact and complete for 60 seconds. Then she straightened up. She put her phone in her pocket. She got out of the car and walked into the hospital. She had patients this morning, and she had work to do, and her hands were steady. Patricia Owens declined all 11 of the media inquiries that reached her through the airline's communications office, and she did it through a written statement that she had composed herself, and that was 6 sentences long, and did not waste a single one of them. She said she had done her job. She said she would do it again without hesitation in identical circumstances. She said the only experience in this story that mattered was Zara's. She said she hoped the conversation now happening publicly would last significantly longer than a news cycle. She said she was grateful to have been on that flight. And then one line at the end, which her communications contact had tried to remove before sending, and which Patricia had put back in calmly and without argument, because it was the truest thing in the statement, and she was not going to let it be removed. I have a granddaughter. She's 6 years old. I did what I would want someone to do for her. The statement ran in 4 outlets. The last line ran in all of them. James received a phone call from Nadia Reyes that afternoon. They talked for 12 minutes longer than either of them had expected, shorter than the conversation probably deserved in the way that important conversations often are. Did you know before you read the documents? Nadia asked. Did you already know you were going to go talk to her before you found out who her mother was? James thought about this honestly, the way he thought about things that deserved honest answers. Yes, he said. The crew report was enough, but when I read the name when I found out who Dr. Okafor was, it became something different. Not the reason I went. The reason I understood what we were actually dealing with. Nadia said she was dropping her daughter off for a flight. She heard shots and she ran toward them. And a year later, that daughter is on one of my planes alone, and a man looks at her and decides she doesn't belong in her seat. I keep thinking about the geometry of that, James said. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Both of them were thinking separately without knowing the other was thinking the same thing about the fact that the commendation was real and the expunged complaint was real, and the CEO's public statement was real, and all of it mattered, every single piece of it mattered. And also, underneath all of it, there was the thing that mattered most, the thing that was not in any document or statement or commendation, the thing that lived only in the memory of the people who had been on that plane. 2 tears running straight down parallel quiet. And then Zara drying her face with the back of her hand and opening her book and keeping reading. That was the part that stayed. That was the part that would keep staying. 3 days after the flight, Brett Holloway was in his office with the door closed, which it had been every morning this week, and he was not working in any productive sense of the word, which was not something that had happened to him often enough in the last 30 years that he had developed a vocabulary for it. His firm had placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review. 2 clients had requested reassignment to different attorneys, citing, in the careful and indirect language that clients use when they want to say something but prefer not to have it written down, concerns about the firm's current public profile. His name, which had been for 14 years the first thing he said when he walked into a room and the first thing he wrote on a new client engagement, was now attached to 19 seconds of footage that had been watched by people in more than a dozen countries. The follow-up article ran that morning. Renee Walsh had asked Zara one question: "What do you want people to take from your story?" And Zara had answered it in the way she answered things after thinking without performance, saying exactly what she meant and nothing she didn't. 3 sentences. I want people to step in faster. Not for me, that part is over. For the next kid who is sitting somewhere, they have every right to be waiting for someone to tell them they belong there. Don't make them wait. Holloway read them. He read them again. He read them a 3rd time. And by the 3rd time, something had changed in the quality of his reading. Not the comprehension, but the reception of it, the way the words were landing, which was differently from the way he had expected. He sat for a long time in the particular silence of a man who has been shown in high definition with 19 seconds of clear footage and a 10-year-old girl's 3 sentences, the gap between the person he had believed himself to be and the person his actions had revealed. The gap was not small. It was not a minor discrepancy between intent and execution. It was the gap between a man who considered himself fair and measured and the product of merit, and a man who had looked at a child in a seat and decided in 3 seconds and without a single fact that she didn't belong. He had seen it now. There was no useful way to unsee it. Whether he would do anything with what he had seen, whether the seeing of it would change anything that came next, whether he would cross the gap or find a way to live on his side of it, was a question that only time and choices would answer. And he did not yet know the answer. And he was, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, in a situation where not knowing was the honest thing, and performing certainty was no longer available to him. He closed the article. He set his phone down on the desk. He looked at the wall. Outside his window, the city was moving through an ordinary Wednesday afternoon traffic pedestrians, the specific gray-gold light of autumn in Washington, everything proceeding with the indifference of the world to any individual's internal reckoning. He watched it for a while, Then slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent his entire adult life moving quickly and is doing the opposite of that. Right now, he opened his desk drawer and took out a piece of paper and a pen. He was not writing a complaint. He was not writing a strategy. He was not writing anything that Carol Whitfield had advised him to write, or that any version of his professional self would have written. He was writing in his own handwriting on a plain piece of paper 3 sentences from a 10-year-old girl's answer to a question a journalist had asked her. And he was writing them not for any audience, but for himself, because something in him understood dimly, beginning not complete, but beginning that they were the kind of words a person needed to write down rather than just read. Adeyeze had requested seat 2A on the evening flight to Washington, and she had gotten it, and she had sat in it for the full duration of the flight with her hands in her lap and the window shade up, looking out at the darkness and the scattered lights of towns below, thinking about her daughter sitting in this exact seat 24 hours earlier alone, going through something that she had been as prepared for as any child could be, and that had been harder than any preparation could fully account for. She thought about the white envelope, and the way she had zipped it herself the night before the flight, holding the zipper pull for a moment longer than was necessary. She thought about what she could have done differently, a question she had been turning over since Ruth's call, and arrived as she had arrived each time she turned it over at the same answer, not much. She had chosen the right seat. She had prepared the right documents. She had taught Zara the right things to do. The thing she could not have prepared for was the specific person who would stop at row 2 on a Monday morning and make a decision about her daughter before her daughter had spoken a word. She had rung the doorbell even though she had a key because she wanted the door to open for her rather than opening it herself. Ruth had opened it, and behind Ruth in the hallway in her pajamas, with her hair down from its braids, book pressed against her chest, white sneakers lined up by the door in the neat parallel line that Adeyeze had taught her Zara. They looked at each other for a full second without speaking. Then Zara walked forward and Adeyeze stepped through the door, and they met in the narrow hallway, and Adeyeze went down to her knees and held her daughter with both arms, completely the kind of holding that does not leave room for anything that is not the holding. Neither of them said a word. Nothing they could have said would have been as specific as the holding. Ruth closed the door quietly. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She gave them the hallway. After a while, Adeyeze pulled back and held Zara by the shoulders and looked at her face with the attention of someone reading something important, the eyes clear and steady, the jaw no longer clenched, the neat braids Ruth had redone that morning, the book pressed against the front of the moon-print pajamas that Adeyeze had bought at the beginning of the school year, and that already looked slightly small the way clothes look when a child is growing faster than the year. "Are you okay?" she said. The same 4 words, but in person in the hallway with both hands on her daughter's shoulders, they carried everything that phone calls can't. "I'm okay," Mama Zara said. She paused. "Are you?" Adeyeze laughed the same slightly broken laugh, the one that was real in a way that smooth laughter never quite is. "I'm getting there," she said. They went into the kitchen together. 3 women, 3 generations, and Ruth had made tea, and there was food on the table, and the radio was on low, and Adeyeze wrapped both hands around a mug and let the warmth travel up through her palms, and for the first time since Ruth's first phone call the day before, she let herself simply be in the room present and not managing anything just here. "Renee called me this afternoon," Adeyeze said. She had her hands around the mug warming them. "She wants to do a follow-up. A few sentences in writing about what you want people to do differently, not on camera, just your words attributed to you at the end of a short piece." Ruth looked at Zara across the table. Zara was turning her mug of hot chocolate slowly with both hands, the specific, unhurried turning of someone who is thinking rather than fidgeting, using the motion to give herself time. "About what I hope comes from all this," Zara said. "About what you want people to do differently," Adeyeze said. "About what would have helped, what you wish had been different." Zara turned her mug one more time. She looked at the surface of her hot chocolate. Then she looked up at her mother with the clear, direct expression of someone who has arrived at the answer and is simply reporting it. "I want people to step in faster," she said. "That's what I want. I don't want kids to have to wait as long as I waited." She paused, and the pause was the pause of someone who wants to be specific, who has been raised to be specific, who understands that the general version of a true thing is always less useful than the specific version. "The flight attendant stepped in," she said. "The captain stepped in. The lady behind me stepped in, and it helped, it really helped, all of it, but I was already scared for a long time before any of that happened. I want the stepping in to happen before the scared part, not after it." The kitchen was quiet. The radio murmured in the background something low and slow, some late-night station playing songs that belonged to another decade. The kettle was cooling on the stove. Adeze looked at her daughter and felt something release in her chest, something that had been compressed since the day before, since the moment Ruth had called and she had stepped into the hallway in her scrubs, and all of the preparation she had done had revealed its limit, had shown her the specific and frustrating truth that there is no protocol for the moment. Someone looks at your child and decides before a word is spoken that she is in the wrong place. That knot had been sitting in her chest for 36 hours. It released now completely and quietly because her daughter was sitting at a kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night, saying the thing that was true. Saying it without anger and without self-pity and without the specific exhaustion of someone who has decided the world is not going to change. Saying it in the voice of a child who is still deciding that it might. Adeze reached across the table and put her hand over Zara's. "I'll tell Renee," she said. Ruth poured more tea. The radio played on. Outside, the Washington autumn had settled into its deep and ordinary evening dark, and the kitchen was warm, and the three of them sat together without needing to fill the quiet with anything other than what was already there. 1 week later, in a fifth-grade classroom in Washington, D.C., Zara Okafor raised her hand before the morning reading assignment began and asked her teacher if she could say something to the class first. Her teacher, who had read the article, who had read Zara's 3 sentences, who had forwarded both to every teacher she knew, said yes without hesitating. Zara stood up. She looked at the faces of her classmates, 22 of them ranging in expression from curious to slightly uncertain, to the specific attentive stillness of children who sense that something real is about to happen and are adjusting themselves to receive it. She was not nervous. She had thought about what she wanted to say for a week, not practicing it exactly, but letting it settle until she knew its shape. She told them about the flight. She told them about the man who had stopped at her row and told her she was in his seat, about the boarding pass, about staying calm because her mother had taught her how, and because she understood what was at stake. She told them about the crew, Patricia and James, and Captain Reyes, who had each in their own way stepped forward and done what people are supposed to do for each other. She told them about Dorothy, who had put a hand on her shoulder and said 4 words, and made something in her relax that she had not realized was still held tight. She told them she had cried exactly 2 tears and dried her face and kept reading her book. She told them she was okay, and then she said the thing she had been building toward, not dramatically, not with the practiced cadence of a speech, but in the plain and unhurried voice of someone reporting a truth they have thought about carefully and arrived at honestly. Belonging is not something you earn by proving yourself to someone who has already decided not to see you. You belong in every room you have the right to be in. No one's 3-second decision changes that. If you ever find yourself somewhere that someone tells you to leave when you've done nothing wrong, hold your place. Breathe. Keep your voice level. Show your documentation if you have it. And then wait not for permission, but for the people around you to do what people are supposed to do for each other. Because they will. Maybe not fast enough, but they will. She sat down. Her teacher stood at the front of the room. and the room was completely still for one full second, the genuine stillness of a group of people who have heard something true and are in the first moment of deciding what to do with it. Then a girl in the third row who had been listening with her hands flat on her desk and her eyes very bright, began to clap slowly, then fully, the way applause builds when it is real rather than performed, and the room came with her one desk at a time until all 22 of them were clapping, and the sound of it filled the classroom with the specific and uncomplicated joy of a group of children recognizing something honest and choosing to say so. Zara did not look away. She did not perform modesty or deflect with a small wave or the tucked smile of someone who is uncomfortable being seen. She sat straight in her seat and looked at the faces of her classmates, and let the sound fill the room and understood perhaps for the first time with her complete 10-year-old understanding what it meant to tell a true thing to people who were ready to hear it and to watch it land. This was where the story had been going all along. Brett Holloway's administrative leave became permanent separation from his firm before the month ended, a decision described internally as mutual and described externally as nothing at all, which is the way these things are described when both parties have agreed that silence is the more dignified option. His platinum membership was formally revoked following the completion of the airline's internal review, the findings of which were not made public but were understood by the people in the relevant departments to be unambiguous. Patricia Owens and James Obey attended a small private ceremony at the airline's Washington operations office, where the VP of operations read their commendations into the record personally. Kevin's 19 seconds of footage was cited in a congressional briefing on unaccompanied minor passenger rights, and Sandra, the gate agent in Atlanta, who had checked every document in Zara's white envelope and walked her to the jet bridge, herself read Zara's 3 sentences on her break and sat for a long time in the break room with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, and then forwarded them to every colleague she had worked with in 11 years with no message attached because no message was needed. Adeze flew home to Atlanta the next morning. She was in the operating room by 7, somewhere in the middle of a long and complex surgery and the specific and total concentration of someone whose hands are doing the most important thing they know how to do. She thought about Zara standing in front of her class saying the stepping in should happen before the scared part. And she thought, yes, that is it. That is the whole thing. That is what every person on that plane was actually being asked to do, and what some of them did, and what some of them didn't, and what all of them were sitting with now. Her daughter had said it better than anyone had said it before in 9 words at a kitchen table with a mug of hot chocolate and a book she had read 5 times. She finished the surgery. She pulled off her gloves. She went to find her next patient. In Washington that same morning, Zara sat at Ruth's kitchen table before school with her hot chocolate and her lighthouse book open to the page about the copper green door, the one about breathing in and stepping through, about finding on the other side not strangeness but a recognizable human world. People going about ordinary days, wanting ordinary things. She had read this page 5 times now. She read it again slowly, the way you read something when you are no longer reading it to understand it, but to be in it, to let it do what it does. Outside, the October light was coming through the kitchen window in that particular gold that only early autumn makes lying across the table in long, warm stripes. Ruth was at the stove. The radio was on. Zara turned a page. She was not simply reading about a girl who walks through doors anymore. She was a girl who had walked through one herself, not because she chose it, but because it was put in front of her, and she had walked through anyway, and had come out the other side, still herself, still reading, still holding the book, still deciding in the specific and irreplaceable way of a 10-year-old who has not yet decided that the world cannot be made better, what kind of world she was going to help build. She turned another page. The light held. The hot chocolate steamed. And the story, which had started on a plane when a man reached across a child's space and took something without asking, ended here in an ordinary kitchen with a girl reading, which is where the best stories always end, not with the wound, but with what the person who survived it chose to do next. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels.